Okay,
All right, Ted,
how's it we'll go?
I'm gonna open it up and let's wait 30 seconds, okay?
Okay. Okay. Hello. Welcome. Uh, I am Ted Shaw. I'm the Julius L. Chambers Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and the director of the Center for Civil Rights. I am going to do a quick word of introduction to kick this off. Uh, Jim Steyer, who was the brains behind the creation of Common Sense, which is a powerful media advocacy organization on behalf of the interest of children. We've known each other since the 1980s. That's a long time. And we've known each other because Jim at one time worked at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where I spent much of my legal career. And Jim has been behind the publication of a book, Which Side of History? The book is subtitled How Technology is Reshaping Democracy and Our Lives. And we're fortunate to have some of those who have contributed to this book with us today, and others, like one of my colleagues, whom I'll also introduce, who has done and does a lot of work about media and technology, and runs a center on media and technology here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So we are thankful that those who have joined us are with us today. Jim is a force, and I'm proud to call him a friend and a colleague. In full disclosure, he has pulled me in as a board member on my second stint of Common Sense. I'm honored to serve as a member of that board. I also want to say a word about David Ardia, whom I mentioned a moment ago. And David will moderate the program today. But David, as I've indicated, is one of my colleagues here at the University of North Carolina. He's the co-director of the Center for Media Law and Policy at UNC Chapel Hill. And he teaches constitutional law, media law, internet law, torts, and has authored all kinds of books and articles that I don't have time to go into. And so, David, thank you for taking on this task. Jim will say a word of introduction. Unfortunately, he has a conflicting obligation immediately after he finishes speaking. He's going to have to depart, but he has assured me that he's confident that those who need to be on the program after he leaves it will be on the program, are on the program. And so, Jim, I turn it over to you, and then you will will be followed by our moderator, who will then take the reins, David Ardia. Okay, Jim.
Thank you very much, Ted. And it's actually great to be here. Even though I am based out in California, I am a huge fan of UNC Chapel Hill. And not surprisingly, I'm a huge fan of Ted Shaw's. We have been friends and colleagues for, my gosh, Teddy, it's amazing. Well over 30 years, first at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And as I'm sure many of you know, Ted is one of the most important civil rights lawyers in the United States over the past 30 years. He ran the Legal Defense Fund. He opened the California office in Los Angeles. He has litigated some of the most important civil rights cases in this country in the past 50 years. And the fact that his chair at UNC Law School is named after Julius Chambers, who is both of our boss at the Legal Defense Fund, is I think is a reflection of the extraordinary leadership that Ted has. So to be here today with all of you is a delight. And also, in addition to Ted's UNC Center for Civil Rights, David, the UNC Center for Media Law and Policy, the UNC Center for Information Technology and Public Life is also a co-host. We have worked with all you folks. We are huge fans, and can't thank you enough for having me join you today to talk a little about the topic. It's about the book, but really about the topic. And then, to be honest with you, you have such a good panel of guests. You don't really need me. They're more distinguished than I am. And there are also folks who are really important folks in North Carolina. So let me just say a few things. One, when I wrote Which Side of History, thank you for holding up the cover, Ted. Actually, I edited the book. I edited it largely with Bruce Reed, who is now the Deputy Chief of Staff, if not really the Co-Chief of Staff for the Biden administration. And the point was that we know we're at a pivotal moment in terms of the role that technology is playing in all of our lives, in our democratic norms and institutions, how it is colliding in certain cases with those norms and institutions. It has a tremendous impact on our fundamental approach to education, as everybody knows from the last 18 months of the pandemic. It has upended many ways of teaching and learning, and every professor in the audience knows that, every student in the audience knows that. And it has had an extraordinary impact, technology has, and technology platforms have, on the social, emotional, and cognitive development of children and families and their mental and physical health. And quite frankly, what Teddy contributed a really great piece to the book about technology, inclusiveness, and structural racism in Silicon Valley. A really, really important point, by the way. And I am sitting in the heart of Silicon Valley right now, about to meet with one of the most important tech CEOs in the country to talk about this very topic. And the book came out almost a year ago, and so much has changed, all of which has been enabled in one way or another by technology. Because at the time the book came out, we hadn't experienced the 2020 presidential election, where, by the way, technology had an extraordinary impact on voting rights, voter suppression, and many other, and quite actually the basic franchise, an area that Ted and some of his colleagues at Chapel Hill and formerly at the Legal Defense Fund are experts on. Our colleague Pam Carlin is now back in my colleague at Stanford, where I teach as my side job. She's back in the Justice Department now, overseeing the voting rights stuff for the country, which is, we all know, under major assault, and in many cases technology enabled. But we hadn't seen the January 6th insurrection at the US Capitol when this book came out. Again, an incident clearly enabled by and amplified by technology and social media platforms. But when we were putting this book together, by the way, I wrote a book a decade ago called Talking Back to Facebook, which brought up many of the issues that Frances Haugen, the whistleblower, has brought up in the past few weeks, from girls' body image and the impact of tech on girls' body image. I had an entire chapter on that. I met with Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg on multiple occasions to discuss the issues about that. So when they claim that this is something new on Instagram and they cover up the research, they've been aware of those issues for many years, as have most of the major tech platforms and social media platforms. But a decade ago, it was clear that harms caused by unregulated technology were multifold. And they included things like, in a kid's standpoint, addiction, attention, distraction issues, body issues, social isolation. By the way, the Surgeon General of the United States, Vivek Murthy, who's a fantastic Surgeon General, wrote a book about isolation and loneliness recently that you all might be interested in on this topic. Also, the undermining of basic norms around privacy. Every law student or law scholar in the audience knows that the 14th Amendment, there's a right to privacy. Well, that was eviscerated in many cases by tech companies. And we passed a law in 2018 in California in order to deal with that. And hopefully we'll see a really strong federal privacy law come forth in the coming months, led by the Biden administration. But it's also led to technology platforms on the negative side have also led to the breakdown of democratic norms and institutions, the amplification of racist and hate-fueled aggression, the incidents that you've seen in North Carolina, in Charlottesville, and all around the country have had a root in social media platforms, particularly the amplification of those messages, the fact that many of the most virulent racist efforts have been organized online, that white supremacy made a comeback enabled by online and social media platforms. This is extraordinary. And we know that those harms have had a particular impact on the social, emotional, and cognitive development of children and teens, and that they've exacerbated the tensions around racial injustice. And any parent knows that. I'm the father of 4. Our youngest son is adopted. He happens to be African-American. I see the impact on Jesse, who Ted knows well, in just the images he's exposed to online. We're about to come out with a big new report next week. David, we should share this with the UNC Center for Media Law and Policy. It's about race and representation in the media. And it'll show you that both the media industry and the tech industry remain dominated by old stereotypic images, whether it's African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans. We've seen this extraordinary rise in AAPI hate now in the United States over the past couple of years. And all of these things have presented an extraordinary challenge to raising children and how to explain to our kids when they see racist content in social media, which has doubled over the past few years, couple of years, at a time, by the way, when kids are online more than ever because of the pandemic and because they've been doing online learning. Kids have been doing that. Your students at Chapel Hill have been doing that, both undergrads and grad students. And kids are experiencing everything from overtly racist messages and images to body shaming messages, sexist, homophobic messages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Listen, I run a large organization, the largest kids media and kids advocacy group in the country, Common Sense Media. We have about 140 million or so unique users. Hopefully a number of you use it as parents to make good choices about the media and technology in your kids' lives. We also have 110,000 member schools, 1.2 million teacher members, and this very, very large advocacy platform. So we see all the benefits and positives of technology too. So I'm not here to be a doomsayer to say that technology is not merely central to so many of our lives. In many ways, it's almost as essential to sort of water and electricity in the air we breathe, and we should recognize that. But in an unregulated, unlegislated fashion, it's a wild, wild west environment where there are many downside consequences that go along with some of the benefits that technology can provide to us in our family lives, in our work lives, and as a society. And what we saw in the last week or two, because of the courage of the whistleblower, Frances Haugen, we know, for example, that Facebook and Instagram have known for years about many of these harms and have covered them up. And we're facing an extraordinary moment, whether it's in North Carolina. I'm hoping that Governor Cooper, Attorney General Josh Stein, whose bedroom I used to stay in when he was in high school when I was working for the Legal Defense Fund, because his dad is one of the major civil rights lawyers in the United States. Now Josh is no longer a teenager, he's your AG, and he's been a real leader on a lot of these issues, by the way. But what you see in North Carolina, what we see at the federal level is an extraordinary wave of support around a clear point that technology's benefits have not been lost. Their abilities to foster connection and advancement in so many ways have not been lost, but it's a critical turning point, epic moment in terms of the chance to right the ship. And we need to stand up and hold the tech companies accountable for the harms they cause, and stand up for the kids and teens and families in our lives, and for privacy, and for sane civil rights laws and voting rights, and the promise and potential of technology harnessed for good, as opposed to being used to amplify negative trends in our society. So it's an extraordinary moment. It's a really great time to talk about this in the context of racist and sexist messages and images on tech platforms and in the media. But ultimately, we're going to have a broader change. I think your state in North Carolina is going to have to lead the way on everything from privacy rights to ways to connect everybody. This is the benefit side. So for example, at Common Sense, we've been a leading organization working with the White House and Congress to make sure that every child is wired, has broadband wiring at home, so that once and for all, we close the ridiculous digital divide that punishes low-income kids and families and prevents them from taking advantage of all the opportunities where educational, for jobs, everything that technology, when used correctly, can produce. We were big supporters of the Emergency Connectivity Fund in the American Rescue Plan, the first big infrastructure plan that Biden pushed through several months ago. And right now, the stakes are very, very high in Washington for both the infrastructure plan that involves broadband money, but also in the Reconciliation Act that will have enormous implications for our kids' education and early childhood development, but also for connecting every child and family with the positive benefits of technology. One of the things that we've done in North Carolina, working with folks like Ted and Josh Stein and Jim Hunt and others, is basically to put our digital citizenship curriculum, which is basically a driver's ed for the internet curriculum, in the vast majority of schools in the state. We think that's incredibly important to teach kids to be savvy and responsible consumers of media and technology, to be able to identify hate speech and racist content, and how to deal with that, but also how to protect their privacy and identity online, and how to recognize misinformation, disinformation through a program of news literacy. So it's an extraordinary moment of opportunity, but challenge. And when you talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, the report I mentioned that's going to come out next week on race and representation, I think will highlight the extraordinary impact that technology and media platforms have on kids' identities, on their perception of race and identity, on their self-perception and self-image, and quite honestly, in fostering either positive or growth in that area of our society, or increasing racial hostility and amplifying hateful racist messages. So we're at this extraordinary turning point. And for leaders in the media and tech industry, where I'm sitting right now in Cupertino, California, it's a huge challenge. But for academics and educators like you're about to hear from on this panel, it's an opportunity to educate your students and the broader public about the perils and the promises of technology platforms. And bottom line, I think you have to be, as a child advocate like we are at Common Sense Media, an optimist. And I think, I hope you are as a professor too, Ted and David and the other panelists, because we either get this right and we either channel all the extraordinary potential of technology and social media in positive directions, or we'll sink our democracy and we'll sink a lot of the basic norms that our kids are growing up with. And so at the end of the day, it's really up to us. And that's why I called the book Which Side of History? Because I think that is the question that tech industry executives and leading companies have to ask themselves. But I also think it's what political leaders need to ask themselves. And honestly, I think it's what academics and scholars like our panelists have to ask themselves. How are we going to shape a better future for this country? How are we going to shape a better future for all of our children? So thank you very much for having me, Ted. And I hope you guys have a great discussion. I'm going to stay on and listen for a few minutes, but I think I've said all that I need to say. I'll let the smart folks of North Carolina take over. Thank you guys very much for having me.
Great, thank
you.
you.
Muted, Ted.
You need to unmute you, Ted? You're still on mute.
Just for a moment, I want to say thank you to Jim for all that he has done, that he does, and for his time with us today. And then turn it over to my brilliant colleague, David Ardia.
Thank you, Ted. Good luck, David.
Yeah,
Great
it's
to see
always tough to live up to Ted's expectations, that's for sure. I'll do what I can. So thank you, Jim, for really highlighting and framing the many issues that are involved under this important topic. And I love your point at the end about whether we see a path forward, and if we don't, what the hell does that mean for our society? I hope that we're gonna cover some very distressing topics as we work through this amazing set of panelists work through these difficult issues. But I do hope that at the end we can offer some solutions or some ways forward that that can give us some optimism. So I don't want those of you that are here that are students thinking to yourself, I'll just throw our hands up. No, you're the generation that's going to help us to fix this. And hopefully a conversation today will be the start of that path. So I'm going to introduce our panelists in a moment, and we're going to do a deep dive into these issues that Jim identified. But first, I just want to let you know, those of you that are joining us through the many different channels with us on Zoom, with us on YouTube Live, we're eager to get your questions. We're going to hold time at the end for you to submit questions. Also, if you want to submit those questions while we're in discussion, I will keep an eye out for what's coming in through the Q&A tool on Zoom. And if a question makes sense to insert into the conversation that we're having among the panelists, I'll do that then. But I promise you, we will hold time at the end for your questions. To submit questions, do not use the chat, don't use the raise hand, use the Q&A tool. It should be at the bottom of your screen. And that's the best way for you to get your questions to us, which I will then pick and read to our panelists. So let me introduce our panelists. I'm going to do brief introductions. There's a lot more to know about them than I could possibly cover in the minute or two I'm going to give. If you want to know more about them, go to the event listing for this event. There's links to their bios. Every one of our panelists is a true expert in this field. And their work is important and worth spending your time to look at. So I'm going to introduce our panelists in alphabetical order. Amelia Gibson is an associate professor at the UNC School of Information and Library Science, and her research focuses broadly on marginalized populations and socio-technical approaches to understanding information marginalization in health and education systems. Rachel Coe is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life at the University of North Carolina, a fantastic new center. I'm a faculty affiliate of the center, and they're a co-sponsor of this event. And we're fortunate that another one of our panelists, who I'll introduce in a moment, is also affiliated with that center. You've met Ted Shaw. Ted is the Julius L. Chambers Distinguished Professor of Law and Director of the Center for Civil Rights. As Jim mentioned, he's the former Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And his research focuses broadly on issues related to the 14th Amendment, affirmative action, racial justice. And Francesca Tripodi is an assistant professor at the UNC School of Information and Library Science and senior faculty researcher at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life. Her research examines the relationship between social media, political partisanship, and democratic participation. So I'm going to direct my first question really to all of the panelists, and they've gotten forewarning that this was going to be the first question we were going to start with. And it's an obvious one to start with, and that is, what are the most important issues related to technology and race that we should be talking about as a society, and we should be talking about on this panel today? I'm going to start because my list of names here is alphabetical. I'm going to start with Amelia, and then let everybody else join in. So Amelia, what's the number one thing we should be focused on with the resources that we have and the time we have to discuss this?
So for me, I since I do a lot of work on health, I'm particularly concerned with the scope, the expanding scope, both in terms of geographic space, but also sort of the conceptual space of data that's being collected, and the scope of services that are being offered, particularly in regard to healthcare. So you have companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon that have access to institutional and individual data, so personal data that we enter, and school data, so Google for Education, and then like Google Health, and it's Also, you have like Amazon Care, so we're getting into actual healthcare provision, and all the comments about it being unregulated, that's bad enough, but also we sort of are meeting this sort of uncritical health care system in our country that is more focused on immediate results in terms of outcomes than on what we think of as these big privacy and social issues, the impacts, right? And so it seems like this perfect storm for some really dangerous impacts on specific communities, particularly communities of color, LGBT folk in particular, who tend not to show up in our studies, our systems analysis sort of approaches to studying the impacts or the successful implementation of healthcare systems that require large amounts of data, right? So to me, that's the most concerning thing, the scope.
Great, and I should say that I'm gonna go through all the panelists to give them a chance to answer this question, but that's not the end of the conversation on these topics. We could spend the whole rest of the time, and I hope we spend a lot of the time talking about that issue. And one of my goals in this first opening question is for us to find common themes across these major problems so that we can explore solutions that might address more than one aspect of the challenges that we're facing. So Rachel, what do you see as the most important issue we should be focused on?
Yeah, thank you for that. And really building off of what Amelia also just shared, right, on the ways that technological solutions really exacerbate existing forms of racism and also existing disparities is something that I've also been thinking a lot about. I think often when people first talk about technology and racism, right, like two things that come front of mind are often policing and mass incarceration. And currently right now, right, like this discussion over online abuse and harmful speech, right? And I think when you think about these two things intertwined, often technological solutions, for example, harmful speech, actually end up resourcing the other, right? Like so more resources towards policing, mass incarceration, and carceral systems in the kind of move to try to solve this other problem. So when you're not thinking about the root causes of problems and trying to innovate your way towards a solution, what you also end up often doing is exacerbating and enforcing existing racial divisions and systems of violence. And I think something that I've been thinking a lot about, especially in regards to policing, this comes from other folks who are really organizing against carceral technologies, right, is that like we can't think about systems of violence like policing as something that can be both democratically or technologically managed, right? That we have to think about these things like at the root, and that like the conversation that often focuses on asking for more regulation or more transparency really is only getting at the question of like, how do we make things quote unquote less violent, right? Without actually addressing the system of violence itself. And so I think like that is like a huge thing that I've been thinking about in relationship to tech and racism. And then I think also to think about the differential impacts. So when we think about something like social good for who? Right? Ways that proportionate harms, benefits, risks, et cetera, that are apportioned onto different kinds of communities. And so there's different forms of vulnerability and precarity that often don't really get talked about when there's this assumption of something that's universally good or harmful.
Thank you, Rachel. So Ted, I have you next. What would you say is the most important problem we should be focused on?
I should have been prepared for that. My apologies. David, I simply am incapable of choosing the most important issue. Let me just try to quickly say why. Won't be a surprise. I think about education and health. I think about the criminal justice system in all of its aspects. And I think about the issues of technology for and on the incarcerated. Think about the proportions of Black people who are incarcerated at some point during their lives, largely in the name of the so-called war on drugs, and they are during the long prison sentences they serve, they are all but completely isolated from technology. And then they're expected, those who come out, to come out and play productive roles in society. How does that work? What about their children who, as a consequence of their incarceration, live almost exclusively in deeply in poverty? And their access to education, their access to technology, democracy, hate speech, as we've heard, all of these issues, flat out internet access for people who are disproportionately poor. I can't pick one of these issues. Technology has profound effect, or lack thereof, on the lives of Black and brown people. And we're scratching the surface with respect to our failure to identify these issues properly and then work to do something about further generations being left out and left behind.
Thank you, Ted. Francesca, what do you see as the most important problem? Or if you can take Ted's route and just give us a whole bunch. What do you see as the most important thing we should be talking about today?
I definitely echo Ted's comments about there's just too many. But I think since I'm last, what I'll do is sort of draw through betweens and the amazing things people have already said. So I think in a lot of ways, what we're dealing with is technology being thought of as this Band-Aid to fix structural problems without addressing said structural problems. And part of that is due to underrepresentation. So we know there's very little diversity when it comes to who's running a lot of tech companies and who's working at tech companies. And then that also influences design decisions. So something that I think we haven't touched on yet, but is equally important, is when whiteness is centered, which it often is in the design and creation of technology, it actually renders people invisible, literally, right? So we see this in facial recognition when people of color are coming on to Zoom calls and having to modify their backgrounds so that they can actually be seen, right, in the workplace and through education. So I would say that's another thing that doesn't make it more important than what anyone said, but I just kind of adding to the conversation of what already brilliant people have been saying.
Yeah, and that, I mean, these are serious, and many people would say obvious problems. And yet we frame this conversation, and it's one I think we can all agree with, that there hasn't been enough done, that the technology companies, largely based on the West Coast of the United States, have not done enough to address these problems. And they're right there in their face. Why aren't we seeing more action, or more? Is it a lack of commitment? Do you think from these companies? What are the obstacles that they're facing that makes their efforts on DEI so ineffectual? Anyone have any thoughts on why we're not seeing? This is the most innovative industry we've ever known. SpaceX thinks it can get humans to the moon in the next few years. These are enormous technical challenges. These are enormous challenges. Why can't we turn that? Why haven't they turned that innovation into effective responses to deal with these issues?
I can. Well, one, I think it's because I think people are too optimistic. I'm gonna build on what Rachel was saying. I think that what happens often with technology, is that it fills what are already existing gaps in like social, political, economic infrastructure, right? And so if we're talking specifically about racism, structural racism in technology, it's just doing what we do, right? Which is we build racist structures. And so it does it more efficiently for us. And so trying to use technology to fix those things, I think, is the wrong approach, right? It's more, you can't fix social problems with technology. You can fix social problems by dealing with the social problem, and the technology that you use will do what you want it. Well, sometimes will do what you want it to do, and sometimes it won't, right? So I think that's part of the problem. And two is this: there is this inevitability that people kind of defer to, a sort of fatalism when it comes to technology, determinism, technological determinism, right? That says it will happen. There's no way back. You can't prevent it. So you should be the one to capitalize on it, right? And that's not always the case. That doesn't always happen, right? Like there are big projects that get abandoned. There are big projects that get halted. Google Health is like, we're not sure what's going to happen with that right now, right? Because they were sanctioned in the UK for using data that they weren't supposed to use, patient data, right? And so I think that sense of fatalism and that kind of like dedication to technological optimism or determinism, I think is problematic. And I think that when you talk about the details of like what structural racism actually means, it's a downer. Like people, that doesn't sell well, right? That doesn't make for a great a shiny speech or a pitch, right? And so it doesn't get funded as well, right? So I think practically these are some of the things we deal with.
I can jump in after Amelia, and I think I can offer like maybe one older example and then maybe a more contemporary one. But I think one of these examples of like techno-solutionism, right, is like if we think about the 90s moment when Clinton and Gore, at the time, they're like, we're going to give every kid a computer, right? And we're going to like get everyone on the internet, and like through this access to information, suddenly everyone's going to feel more empowered, and we're going to fix these economic disparities, right? And at the same time, so this idea of like getting everyone online or getting people wired, and so this kind of simultaneous like rhetoric of technological empowerment and identity empowerment actually wasn't really addressing, right, like these root causes of state sanctioned economic and racial violences that were happening in the 90s. And that same year that they were like, we're going to get every kid a computer, they were also like, we are also going to pass a ton of legislation that is going to make it really difficult for people to get welfare benefits, make it really difficult for like people who are undocumented, for immigrants to access these resources. And we're also going to really network up the carceral system, right? And also bring that online. And so it's like this twin moment where the same infrastructures that are imagined to be empowering is also really intertwined with ones that are enforcing these forms of enforcing racist systems. So I think, and also now in the current moment, I think there's ways that when we see big tech companies like respond to moments of racism, they're often at these like very heightened moments, right? And so there's like a kind of temporality of how corporations respond to what's really visible and to a kind of exceptional form of racial violence, right? Without really thinking about the slower and less visible forms. And so that kind of temporality makes it easy, and people have critiqued this, right? Like the kind of putting out of a statement in a moment and then something else happens and there's a different kind of statement, like unrolling some of the things that were claimed before. And so I think there's that kind of aspect of treating these moments, right, of exceptional violence or exceptional racism as like these individualized ones that aren't tied to a longer legacy, that, right, that then like the solution is never, as Francesca pointed out, like becomes a band-aid as opposed to something that's really uprooting or grasping at their roots. So I think like that's something to think about. And I think the last thing that I will also say is, right, that often the other forms of solutions, there's still this kind of ongoing erasure of race through different, through the ways that tech companies will say things like, okay, we're going to think about digital inclusion or digital ethics, right? And like that kind of language often actually like obscures the actual, right, like forms of racism that are occurring. And so there's, I think that is also something that's happening, that there's a kind of, while addressing the thing, also erasing the very problem that like technology is trying to seeking to address.
Can I also say that in the commercial and in like the practice space, there's an ahistorical slant to everything. It's always forward looking, right? And so I'm going to pull Rachel's one laptop per child moment into the COVID era. Chromebooks, every kid needs a Chromebook, right? And we have to make sure that every kid can get online so they can have online school through Chromebooks. And also there's this monitoring programs that we can use to make sure that your child is paying attention and not going to another app. And we can also add suicide prevention to that. I mean, these are things that these are discussions that I've heard from several school systems around the country this past year, right? And so there's all these fixes, all these like small technological fixes that, in my view, sort of rebuild the same 90s, that same 90s pipeline that we built, right? But with digital data. And at the same time, we see a ramp up of like data warehousing in the interest of protecting kids. So social services and police services, criminal justice and medical services and early intervention, data warehousing at the state level, right? That seems like it's a thing that would be positive. But if you're combining all that data, the history tells us that doesn't work out well for children of color, for example. It doesn't work out well for disabled children, right? And so, yeah, just to build on what Rachel was saying.
I want to share some thoughts that probably are in many quarters deeply unpopular. But I think when we talk about technology, when we talk about Silicon Valley, some of what explains the ways in which some people have been left behind or left out is old stuff. It's straight out racism, the rumors of inferiority, but also lack of access to educational opportunities, et cetera. It's not only, though, explainable by who has access to elite educational opportunity. I mean, think about Bill Gates and some others who only had a high school degree, although they could have had graduate and postgraduate degrees, obviously at elite institutions. But there's this old saying, those who resemble usually assemble, and people replicate themselves. And that's still true. And it's not only racism, sexism is enormous in Silicon Valley. From what I understand, because I haven't spent any time in Silicon Valley, but I've talked to people who have. But clearly a lot of women witness and experience deep discrimination in Silicon Valley. And so I think all of those things still exist. We have, my wife and I have children in middle school. The stories they tell us when they come home about the things that are said by their classmate that are racist and sexist and homophobic, they're shocking. It's not like we've gotten better in ways that put all this stuff behind us. Is still very much with us. And when you're talking about the contemporary power centers in this country, who gets what opportunities, these old ways are still very much with us. So I can't say that it's that simple, because there's nothing simple about it, and it's deeply troubling.
I think the only thing I'd like to add to this these great points is that we think of technology and access, because access is definitely a problem. I mean, digital divide, we recognize this. But then it's very fascinating to see the one laptop to the one Chromebook, et cetera. But still, we aren't dealing with what Esther Hargitay refers to the second level digital divides. The fact that you can give a child a laptop, but if they don't know how to navigate or get onto different apps, or haven't been immersed with it since a young child, or their parents don't know how to get on and off of different learning situations, or navigate medical help, the technology itself is only one part of the divide issue, teaching people skills and how to utilize these tools. And then also, this deals with, Alice Marwick has talked a lot about this as well with privacy, right? So, navigating privacy constraints, understanding surveillance, recognizing that there's this software on your preloaded onto your Chromebook that's being given to your child under the purposes of education, and not even thinking about how these might be grabbing all this data and putting it into a center that then mines it and determines, oh, your kid's actually tracked now for a different kind of educational experience, right? And so I think we have to think about how digital divides are not just the tangible technology, but other things as well.
I'm going to add that the outcomes are beyond just the domain. They surpass the domain, right? So if we're talking about a company like, and I don't want to vilify Google, there are several examples, right? But if you're talking about a company that gives your child a laptop, because they are business partners, they are then fine under, they can collect that data under FERPA, right? That same company is a business partner with your hospital system. They can collect that data under HIPAA, right? And there are cases about this right now, right? Google saying that because the data is anonymized, that it's fine, but it's easily, it's easy to de-anonymize data, right? To re-identify people using data. And so what does it mean to consent or to not consent if what you're talking about is public education? What does it mean to consent or not consent if you're talking about the only hospital in your area, right? What does it mean to, like, what are the impacts there? And then also, if you're looking at a company like Amazon, where, well, not just Amazon, but a company that might be doing business with, say, Border Patrol or immigration that provides biometric data, right? Like, what does it mean to consent individually to something that might be harming your whole community, right? So these are the things, when I talk about the scale, this is what I mean by the scale of the data that's collected. It's also it could be my health insurance, it could be my health provider, it could be all sorts of things, because it's everything at this point.
One of the things I'm hearing reminds me, I teach an internet law course, and I have a start of the semester, we talk about technological utopianism. I have the students all read John Perry Barlow's Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, published in 1996. And it's got this flowery language about how all the world's problems are going to be gone, because those of you who live in the physical space, hey, you do your thing, but we're going to live in this cyberspace, and we're going to be able to solve all of our problems. And every year I have my students read that, it gets older and older and older in terms of its application to the world they live in. And at this point, the students are like, this is crazy. How could anyone have ever possibly believed this? But yet we see this sort of utopianism, this view that technology, if we just build it better or we make it more widely available, it's going to fix everything. And I'm hearing from all of you that that isn't the case at all, that in fact, the focus on the technology itself is simply reinforcing and reifying existing systemic problems we have in our society. And I loved one of you mentioned, I think it was you, Francesca, a Band-Aid, right? A Band-Aid covers a wound. A Band-Aid doesn't heal a wound. I mean, maybe it does a little bit, but mostly it just makes it so you don't see it anymore. Is this focus on technology and the way we are viewing technology? And I should add to that this view, which I think you're all going to agree with. Is it neutral? You mentioned design, Francesca. Our biases go into the things we build. How do we deal with that? And it tied in a little bit to your book chapter, Ted, which was when we look at who works in these companies, they don't look like most of the country. How should we be thinking about dealing with this issue that a large proportion of the public thinks that if we just build a better technology, we're going to solve these problems?
I also want to just bounce into, since you brought up Barlow, I'm going to throw it in the chat so people can connect to it if they're interested. I think Barlow's Declaration of Independence is also so indicative of the mindset of Silicon Valley, right? that is drawn, it is, emphasizes a neoliberal agenda, right? It is an individualistic, market-driven culture. And so when we're like, oh, how did it fail? I think sometimes, I think the cyberspace is such a beautiful declaration, right? Because it both shows, okay, first of all, how could anyone think that cyber was going to be disconnected from our world, right? I mean, in one way, is what you're saying, David, is what I'm hearing are students saying, okay, this is like so silly because we are so interconnected, our online, offline. It's kind of reminiscent of the academic like on and offline self that used to happen too, right? Sherry Turkle's wonderful conversation about like play, and you could be whoever you wanted, the dog cartoon, no one knows you're a dog, right? I think a lot of what your students are picking up on is really smart, right? And that like everyone knows you're a dog because you've got to register your print. No one can pretend anymore. But I think the Barlow declaration is also really telling about like who created this space and what was its creation for, and the anti-regulatory stance of it, I think is also really important to like knowing that lineage as well.
I mean, Amelia, to go back to your focus on health, it wasn't too long ago that the Google flu tracker was going to be the end of all flu epidemics, and that hasn't turned out the way we expected. We're really seeing the sort of this technological utopianism hitting up against our experience with COVID in ways that I hope is making your work much more, it's always been relevant, but much more in demand as we're starting as a world to realize that these technological tools are not solving some of the problems we thought they might be.
I guess I'll jump in here. I think David, to your question too about like biases like built in, and I think this will also maybe touch on both like Ted and Amelia's comments too about like history, precedents, and also this kind of more collective scale. And I think when we think about the different biases or biases that get built in, or when things are like that, I think many people who study tech and racism point out, right, like that the bias is part of the design, right? Like it's intended and meant to be biased. It's meant to select, deselect, et cetera. And a lot of the, like what's happening is, right, that there's like assumptions really about like who is the individual and the universal that are really getting embedded. And so, for example, even, and I think Amelia's example really points us to this like kind of question about like privacy, right? Like, and so this notion of individual privacy is also one that has historic roots in whiteness and in like, and especially in white masculinity, who had the right to individual privacy that was very much tied to race, access to capital, access to property, right? And so when that kind of logic also then gets embedded into this assumptions, right, about like, okay, so we're designing for individual privacy, it really also the fact that, right, like these questions around safety is like something that is really also communal and collective, right? And so that there's like collective practices and things to think about. And I think the other thing around bias that I might just add in might also just be, and I think we've talked about really the presentist approach of technology to systems of harm and of racism. And I think one of the things to really think about is like the precedents, like what's happening with our hospital data and all of that is also, again, like built on different precedents around systems of violence. And so, for example, like the third party data doctrine, right, is like actually very much tied to precedents around decisions about what law enforcement agents do or don't have access to, like what can they subpoena from individuals. And so one of the earlier cases in like the 70s was this idea, right, like that whether or not financial records from a bank, could that be accessed with or without a warrant? And they were deemed, right, like to be not confidential, but something that like somebody has voluntarily given to the bank. And so this idea, right, of like, I'm voluntarily like giving my information, quote unquote, right, or quote unquote consenting to give this information because I want access to healthcare. And there's like data brokerage. I think when we think about them, the precedents that are being used to make determinations of what data companies, what tech companies can or cannot give, they're kind of rooted actually like in these other precedents that were about policing people, about disenfranchising people. And right, like, so that same logic of what was happening in the 70s around like data brokerage, those same issues that Amelia was also pointing out, right? Like those are the same things, for example, in 2018, when ICE was thinking about those like virtual dragnets and the extreme vetting initiative and using social media monitoring to kind of decide who to deport and to track down these deportation leads. Like all of that is part of, right, like the same kind of messy assemblage of thinking about when we think about the things that are being built now, what is embedded in them.
Yeah, let me expand on that, Rachel, because something that I was hoping that we would get to talk about is the increasing reliance on algorithms. And so we're starting to see, these tools that are, as often happens, you have mission creep, right? You start to see the tool developed in one context being used in another. We're beginning to see algorithms, machine learning algorithms being used to make bail decisions, for example, whether or not someone is entitled to be free pending trial. And if they are, what amount do they have to pay to do so? We're seeing it being used already in the determination of certain types of welfare benefits. Should we be worried about sort of AI and machine learning algorithms becoming more of a problem in terms of exacerbating existing systemic bias in our society? Is that something that each of you is looking at or are concerned about?
Well, I want to add to that, David, without having the answer, but you just brought to mind that there's been expert testimony in some cases involving the criminal justice system, capital punishment or incarceration, in which experts have testified using algorithms about not only the likelihood, but the certainty that some people are going to engage in criminal behavior. And that has been put forward as a basis for determining who gets incarcerated and what kind of sentences they get. Race, of course, is a huge part of that, but it's these algorithms that are being used, even in that context, that are deeply troubling.
So I'm gonna say I'm torn here. On one hand, in the healthcare space, when people have taken the time, again, this is about getting to like the root causes, right? When people have taken the time to do both the sort of ethnographic, qualitative research on how people perceive things like pain and when those are associated with certain diagnoses, we've been able to see improvements on diagnosis for people of color, specifically for Black people with diagnoses that have been a problem. So the pain in healthcare is like a big thing, especially with Black people, right? Like the under treatment of pain, and that leads to under treatment of all sorts of cancer, all sorts of things, right? So that's one thing. But the other thing is that in healthcare, there have long been algorithms, right? There are like correctors for kidney function, correctors for like all sorts of things that basically say that Black people or operate at a lower healthcare level naturally, quote unquote, right? Black women are more at risk if they have VBAC, so vaginal birth after a cesarean, right? So these assumptions about the ways that we should be experiencing our healthcare are evidence of structural racism, systemic racism that are being challenged more and more now. And I love to see it. I'm really excited about it, right? So the thing that makes me optimistic on that side is that putting those into a system requires you to make those assumptions and those algorithms explicit. And those are providing opportunities for people to challenge long-held assumptions. That's not to say that the algorithm itself is making it better, right? But it's an opportunity to say, hey, like, why are you using a corrector there? What is that variable that you're putting in there? On the other hand, like we do see things like bias in sentencing. We see things like unquestioned, like we're seeing a lot of this algorithms making, sort of codifying bias and discrimination so that it's done more effectively and more efficiently, right? And so healthcare insurance is one of those spaces where, especially for disabled people of color, the efficiencies of insurance often obscure the discrimination that that disabled people experience, and people are denied services, denied things that are life preserving, right? Without any response as to why, and without cause or any method for appeal. And so this is I'm of two minds here.
And I'm going to take, Amelia, your conflict here as an opportunity for us to explore some possible solutions to some of the things we've been talking about. And one of them is something that Jim mentioned, which is privacy protections, something you mentioned earlier as well. And it relates to one area of aspect of regulating algorithms is transparency about the algorithm itself, right? What's the underlying code? What are the assumptions that were used in building the algorithm? All of those things right now, we really have very little knowledge about with regard to most of the algorithms that have an influence on our lives. But there's also this piece, which is the data that goes in, right? So what's the learning data set that the algorithm was trained on? And we're seeing, for example, in the hiring context, that there are major problems that those data sets are not representative, or if they purport to be representative, they're full of all kinds of bad data that isn't accurate. Part of the effort there's a big push in Congress, whether or not it's going to succeed or not. We've seen more interest in proposed bills than we've ever seen with regard to regulating algorithms. And they relate one to transparency around the algorithms themselves, and the other with regard to data. Can we do this better, Amelia, if these types of laws pass? Will you be more optimistic and less conflicted? Is there a path forward that you're thinking could lead us in a better way?
I don't know that I'd be more optimistic, just because, well, from what I've seen, enforcement of these kinds of laws rely on voluntary disclosure of like behavior that the track record just hasn't been great, right? And so what would make me happier is more publicly funded research, more research that we can see into, more qualitative research, less emphasis on quantitative sort of clinical trial type research, more social scientists involved in technology and healthcare specifically. I mean, it's just this, I would like to see more acknowledgement that that other people do this and know things that impact the way that technology, specifically in healthcare, should be happening, right? The way that healthcare should be happening beyond basic and medical research. So that's my corner of the world.
Francesca, I'm gonna, so it's Frances Hagen that was referenced by Jim, the whistleblower for Facebook, who really opened a lot of people's eyes about, first of all, what Facebook itself knew. Many of us had suspected Facebook understood these things, but now we know it clearly. But Amelia mentions, more research. One of the things that stymies those of us that study, and yet I know you study misinformation, that is that we simply don't know what's going on these platforms. Could we, devise a set of transparency obligations that wouldn't rely on, employees willing to lose their jobs and face ostracization within their communities to tell us what's going on? Is there a better way for researchers to do this?
Oh, that's like $1 million question. I mean, I think what Amelia writes in here is really important, that there needs to be more research, more public access. We have very little understanding about how these platforms that we continuously interact and engage with, what they're doing with our data, how they're using our data, why they want us to engage, how they're trying to engage with us. You know, it's a fine line, right? I mean, even in situations, this is of course what I think super interesting, right? You have the launch of like CrowdTangle, where we thought we were getting access to data, and social scientists were like vetted into getting access with their data, and then they were kind of finding things that didn't bode well for the public perception of these corporations, and then it got locked out. Like we see these researchers in New York that got locked out of Facebook's data collection. We see CrowdTangle itself shifting in terms of what it's giving us access to. But I think, you know, until these platforms, maybe it's a requirement to give us this data, but then again, I'm equally skeptical as to what kind of Amelia just said in terms of like regulation and policies are super important. They're a really, really good first step. But then like who is monitoring that regulation and who's holding those who violate that regulation accountable? You know, obviously Facebook has an extremely robust team of social scientists who are paid for. I mean, I think that's like the best part about this whistleblower is that they had report after report going up saying, I don't think what we're doing is ethical and is problematic and is causing like real harm to people that use our platforms. And nothing happened with it. So I think, you know, part of it is public access. I think, unfortunately, part of it is going to have to be more of this internal whistleblowing where people inside the organization say things. You know, this is just tangentially related, but I think another great example of that is the Netflix employee who recently came out on Twitter about what a problem it was, the new Dave Chappelle comedic routine that came out and its defamatory nature towards trans people. They used Twitter to draw attention to that and then were kind of put on a leave of absence, right? So I think there's this, I don't really have a good answer. I also have one more source I'm going to throw out to the attendees because I love reading. Obviously, I'm an academic, but Tamara Knopper has a really great conversation about the scored society that I think also speaks to Amelia's conversation about that like tension, right? Because at first, the scored society banks have been notorious and, you know, redlining part of the historical reasoning behind segregation in the United States. And so in some ways, these alternative scores could feasibly create better equality when it comes to lending. But then she complicates that by saying, yeah, but we aren't really quite sure how things are being scored and why. And then because of what we've already talked about, a lot of the problems with those scoring systems just kind of come creeping back in. So I think there is some possibility for these things being helpful. And I really liked Amelia's conversation about pain medication, because I think that is a super important point. Oh, excellent, yay. Thank you.
I'll call out with regard to the protection. One of the things that we could do is create more robust protections for whistleblowers within companies. And I'll call out Professor Mary Rose Papandreou's work at the law school has written about this, that we don't have particularly strong protections for whistleblowers who see problems within their organizations. Even for government employees who we expect to have a duty to disclose, they often face serious repercussions. So we could, you know, improve the flow of information from insiders by, for example, creating protections for whistleblowers. So there's some place that the law could come in and improve the flow of information to the public. I'm thinking something that I want to direct to you, Ted, which, you know, so in my field, the FCC is quite involved with regard to broadcast regulation. 1934 Communications Act, the FCC was tasked with promoting competition, diversity, and localism. And through its broadcast licensing powers, we can be less than sanguine that those powers were utilized in the most effective ways. But still, we had an agency, we had a federal agency that was tasked with improving the communications landscape, recognizing that a diversity of voices and viewpoints was a benefit, that if we supported local sources of information, that would be better for society, and that if we didn't allow there to be monopolies to control communication systems, that would be a plus for society. So one of the proposals that's talked about now is something like an FCC, something like a regulatory agency that could come in and start to think about how we would monitor and regulate these new industries. That when we face new industries, doesn't law have a role? Ted, this is my question to you. It's a long one because I'm an academic too. Doesn't the law have a role here in dealing with these kinds of deep institutional imbalances?
Well, David, as soon as you started to put forward this question, it began to take me to the fact that the FCC played a role in one time opening up opportunities to members of racial minority groups and to make sure they had opportunities, licensing opportunities, whether we were talking about radio stations or TV stations, et cetera. Almost all of that has gone down the tubes now. And the fact that for those few African Americans who were able to successfully negotiate that world, eventually almost all of them have been bought out by the huge monopolistic or something close to it, corporations that run the media world these days. You're asking, I think, a somewhat analogous or another question about what can be done. Doesn't law have something to say about addressing the problem of the exclusion of people of color, the ways in which Silicon Valley tends to be monochronism, or whatever the word is I'm looking for, but the related question of also sexist and gender exclusionary, at least with respect to race. The now constant attack on conscious efforts to open up opportunities and to redefine those efforts as racist themselves make the world in which one might be able to negotiate intentionally changing. The exclusiveness of Silicon Valley and the tech world or whatever, much more difficult. And the threat and the realities of so-called reverse discrimination litigation makes all of that much more difficult too. So in some ways we've certainly seen it with respect to media companies, but I think it probably would be similar with respect to the tech world or Silicon Valley. It's even more difficult than ever, not less, to try to work these changes through law.
So we're right at the time when I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience, but we haven't heard from Rachel. I don't know if you want to add anything to this, what has become our conversation about what might be potential solutions. And of course, we've heard that there are 4 easy ways to fix this problem. So you just add yours and then we're good to go. I'm being facetious, of course. And then I'll start to ask some questions that came in through the Q&A, but I want to ask Rachel, do you have anything that's you're thinking is a path forward in addressing some of the problems we've been talking about?
I'll keep my comments very short to move us into the Q&A, but I do want to echo the thought about like how do we better resource community-led research and also pull those voices like more into the forefront of like the debates about technology, about race, about structural inequity. I think that's really important. And I think tied to that, right, is that I think we need to have much more nuanced conversation about how power operates in different layers and through society. And I think like those two, maybe one is more actionable than the other, but I think there's a lack of real analysis of power in both like local, transnational, right, like contexts in which all of these major platforms are operating. And I think that understanding needs to happen, but to do that needs to be the resourcing of more input, more research and more knowledge production by grassroots communities that are already doing this work.
And just, I'm gonna, as an example of someone in a group that's been doing amazing work over the last few years, Tawana Petty's work in Detroit and the Detroit Technology Project. They've done amazing work that was community initiated, activist sort of research in consultation with researchers, and she's done amazing work on the difference between safety and surveillance and knowing your neighbors and privacy. And I would love to see more of those voices in this research space, not just academic researchers. Well, also academic research. She's also an academic now.
Francesca, you're unmuted. Did you have something that you wanted to add?
No, I didn't realize I unmuted myself. I must have done that while I was taking notes. I'm sorry.
So let me read we've got a couple of questions that came in. Let me read the first one. Regarding the one laptop per child idea, I'm also fascinated by the supposed policy panacea promoted by politicians and all major tech companies of, quote, teach kids from oppressed groups to code as a path out of poverty. But even if everyone learned to code, wouldn't the skill be devalued? Isn't coding already being automated and offshored, yet we still hear this argument? What does this trend, if folks agree with the broad sketches of it, say about how people in power see technology and the labor market? Anyone want to jump in on that one?
I can, so I don't have an answer. But I am gonna say, I'm gonna promote Dan Green's book, which is on exactly this topic, the promise of access, right? This idea that that coding and technology is often used as a fix for economic and social problems, and that it usually ends up causing greater harm to the communities, not just devaluing coding, right? But like it causes greater harm to the communities that it's purporting to serve in the first place. Sorry, Rachel, you were gonna jump in.
Yeah, I think just to quickly also respond, not that it's a full answer, but I think it kind of goes back to this idea of like individual uplift, right? Like these kind of narratives about personal uplift, empowerment, that is really tied to that, right? Like, so this idea you can teach yourself to code, you can move yourself out of, right, like poverty, or you can, and this is also really tied to, as I think about it, like this 90s moment as like, right, like kind of this idea of getting everyone wired. When we think about that moment also in 1996, the personal responsibility and work opportunity reconciliation act, like those moments, right, of like, okay, we're going to move people off of welfare, off of public benefits and services, like with this idea, right, like through individualism and individual empowerment, you can work your way out. And so I think this is now very much tied to when we think about the gig economy, when we think about this idea of like turning workers into entrepreneurs, what does that also do with like the politics of labor organizing? I think those are all like a mix of conversations to be had together.
So the next question is, thank you all for having this discussion. This topic is incredibly relevant to my experience as a Black computer engineer who has experienced racism in technology and other places. My question is, if I were to be admitted into law school and became an attorney, how could I best get involved in anti-racist efforts?
Wow. Um, uh, Let me first say that that question deserves some more reflection before I could really give it a good answer. I mean, the immediate and obvious answer is that someone who's admitted to practice could work in anti-racism endeavors by becoming a civil rights litigator. Having said that, and as somebody who has been a civil rights litigator for over 40 years now, this is a tough time to engage in that work. It's always tough, but it's an even tougher time because of the direction that the judiciary has taken, and that we can anticipate given what the court looks like. Although it was not, the kind of work I think you're talking about that you do, I wanted to mention, some of you may be aware of the case that was in the Supreme Court just this past term involving Byron Allen and Comcast. And his challenge saying that they discriminated against him in his attempts to be able to get programming in this this company that he owned that broadcasted television shows, etc. Tough case, tough result. The other thing I want to say is, as a lawyer, we have a lot of lawyers. I'm not saying we don't need more civil rights lawyers, because I'm always looking for those interested in doing that work. I don't know that we have a whole lot of people doing what you're doing. And so for me, the question might not be you becoming a civil rights lawyer, although you may decide to do that, but how you, as someone who does the work that you do, can get the attention of civil rights lawyers who can work with you. Maybe you've done that already or tried to do it quite a bit, but I'm always excited to see people, African Americans, people of color, women, who do the work of the kind that you're doing, who move into the tech world, people with STEM backgrounds, for example, et cetera. It's up to you in terms of what you want to do. But I'm glad to see people that do what you do. And it's painful for me to hear what you're experiencing. So that's my rambling answer, but it does require more thought and reflection, I think, for me to really give a better response.
So let me add a couple of thoughts to Ted's response. One is that, of course, you can pursue work in the courtrooms of this country as a civil rights lawyer, and that work is so important, more important today than it's ever been, and it's always been a challenge. But I think to broaden the lens just a little bit, and that is to think about how, so there's this saying that there's West Coast code and there's East Coast code. So West Coast code is the code that the software engineers write, that Facebook runs on, and the software that you use. And that has a very powerful influence on what you can do in the world. Then there's East Coast code. East Coast code is the laws that come out of Washington, D.C. And we can talk about some of the incredible victories Ted has had because of the Civil Rights Act. We can talk about how important the Voting Rights Act is. We can talk about how important Federal and state legislation can be in one signaling to our nation what our values are, but also saying some behaviors are simply not acceptable. So to just focus on a bunch of private actors on the West Coast is to miss the opportunity that exists in terms of our ability to influence those decisions, to require more transparency, to create robust privacy protections, to demand that that these innovative technologies be developed in ways that are more likely to lead to the outcomes that benefit society. That's hugely important work. And I would say that someone who's committed to anti-racist work can have a huge impact in those conversations with a law degree, working on a committee in the House or Senate, advising legislators, advising the FEC or FCC or the other agencies that have a role. FTC has become much more emboldened under the Biden administration in enforcing privacy laws and seeking more competition among these platforms. So I think there are a lot of ways to bring that approach and have a huge impact. And as I tell my students all the time, you know, the way we think about law's role today is going to have an impact for the next 100 years. Just like laws, Antitrust Act, Sherman Antitrust Act from the early last century has an impact on the environment we live in today. The laws that we devise and pass today are going to have a long impact. And we really need as many people committed to doing this work well to be involved in the crafting of this legislation. We may have a closing window in terms of public perception and pushback against these technology companies that isn't going to last forever. And we need good people in Washington and in the state attorneys general's offices and in state legislatures around the country to address these issues.
And David, I have to say that's a much better answer and response than mine. Thank you.
But your work is important too, Ted. I mean, so we need both. We need people out there crafting the laws, and we need people out there enforcing the laws. And we need great lawyers, committed lawyers to do both. So we only have a few minutes left. We're here at a fantastic, amazing research university, University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Is there more that this university can do, that universities can do to address some of these problems? I mean, all of us on this panel have committed our lives to working within an academic institution. What should we expect from a university like UNC? Is there something that that universities can do here? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
I guess in the quiet, I can go first really quickly. Given that I used to work at universities, more multicultural student centers, and on the kind of diversity and equity end of the university before I started a PhD. And I think, so kind of seeing both sides of those, right? I feel like similar to what I had said earlier about tech companies responding to racism in moments, right, of exceptional violence or like a kind of big thing that happens in the press. Like, I think many times institutions will focus on reputation management over the interests, I think, of students. And I think there's often ways that the kind of language of inclusion, like, will hire more faculty, will bring in more students of color, while you're not changing then the way that this structurally an institution runs, is you're also not creating an environment where people can come in and actually survive, right? Like in this institution. And so I think that change at institutions needs to happen, and it can't just always be a listening session or a forum in response when something happens, right? That there needs to be true commitment and action to some of the things that are said. And at the level of like hiring and recruitment, it's also on the other end, so that people who are brought in can actually succeed and stay.
I think an institution like UNC could be bolder, and it could take stances and not try to avoid controversy and not be so concerned about donors that it won't do work that might be considered controversial, right? It should lean against moments like the moment we're in right now, where people are like, oh, race, everything is critical race theory, and critical race theory is bad, right? So let's like not talk about things, and let's not do work that might get us bad attention from people who might be mad at us, right? That's what we're here for. If we can't do work that might get us attention because people are having a political moment, like a hissy fit of a moment, then we shouldn't be doing the work. And so that's, I think, having some sense of moral courage is important, especially for an institution that is supposed to be serving the state, right? Yeah, that's what I think we could do.
I have to agree with that. I think that was well put, although I also feel compelled to acknowledge the moment that you're referring to, that we find ourselves in, and not only at UNC, but in higher education in general, particularly in public institutions. I saw an article in the last day or two about, I think it was the University of Georgia, and its move to end tenure, and thought about the implications of that for the kinds of issues that we're talking about and that you're raising. These are precarious times, and we all know that. And there's a lot of vulnerability increasingly on the part of anybody who stands up against certain kinds of entrenched powers that be. I hope that, I mean, we have enough already on our hands here at UNC. I hope it doesn't go down the road that Georgia appears to have gone down and is going down.
Francesca, any last thoughts before we wrap up?
Since we're talking about technology, I think another thing that universities often don't think about is the role these technology partners play in perpetuating surveillance and selling of data, and being mindful in terms of who we choose as vendors and why those vendors are advocating for the public good, especially at a public institution. But also echoing what others have said as well, I think we're extremely awesome. I'm just trying to think of something else to say.
Well, we're right at the end of the time that we'd said we'd wrap up. So although all of you in the audience can't clap your hands and show up, but you can clap your hands in front of your computers at least. Please join me in thanking our amazing panelists and